Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Morning Coffee with Cameron. In today's video, we're here to continue on with the Future Garage Mega Series, and in this video, I wanted to talk about leads and lead sound design, some common instruments and things like that, some processing ideas that just kind of are common to the genre and things I hear a lot and do a lot myself. I also wanted to talk about some music theory concepts to help you create those dark, sad melodies, and then finally, I wanted to cap things off with talking a little bit about layering and just kind of using complementary sounds to build up a bigger, thicker sound overall. So let's hop into DAWg here and get started. Okay, so like I said, today we're going to be talking about some melody stuff, some music theory stuff, some common instruments, and just some sound design ideas to help you get, the right vibe going and stuff, and I guess how to write, these types of melodies and whatnot. So let's go ahead and take a listen to the melody section here, and then I'm going to break down the instrumentation and then talk about some of the music theory aspects in order to create these types of melodies. So let's go ahead and take a listen now. So, it's really pretty and it's really dark and it's also a bit, dreamy, spacey, I guess would be the words to describe it. So let's go ahead and solo out just the actual melody stuff here just to get an idea of all that's actually happening without all the atmospheric stuff in the way. And that's pretty much it. And you hear it's very simple, but it also feels very big. And part of this comes from the pad layer. So the pad layer, like I talked about in the pad video, is acting as both a way to supplement the pad we've created, but also in this case, it's feeding into kind of hug around the melodic instruments and stuff like that. But we'll kind of get into that here in a minute when we talk about layering and stuff to, get kind of a final, more polished sound. So this whole song started off with a basic piano motif, and I'm going to tell you basically how I made this piano sound the way it does, because it's pretty cool, and it's a very common way to, make this type of sound in Future Garage. So the actual piano sound itself is just a straight up piano, one of my pianos I designed in Piano V from Arturia here, and let's take a listen. And that's really it, and that's the whole idea behind the song. So from there, what I did is actually add a reverb, and this is just a nice way to fill out a bit more space. 3-second reverb, pretty much. I think this is actually the default setting of aural reverb. I might have tweaked the wet balance a bit, but that gives me this. So just a bigger piano sound overall, maybe just a bit more emotional. So after that, I feed this into PSP Micro Warmer. Now, Micro Warmer is a saturator thing, but ultimately Micro Warmer is a dynamics processor. So similar to what I did in the bass design video with that Neuro-E one-shot, just compressing the reverb tail of the piano, but I'm also adding a bit of heat and a bit of bite with this saturation. But this lifts up the reverb tail in a really interesting way that makes it sound very big and pretty, and makes it sound, instead of like, a piano with reverb on it, it just makes it all kind of squeezed together into one completed sound. So that sounds like this. And you see I'm being pretty aggressive here. But do you see how that sounds so much bigger? So from there, what I did is grab an EQ, and I'm just clearing out some space because we don't need any low-end information. I want this occupied almost solely by the Reese and kick. Cutting out a bit of room here in the 500 hertz region. There was just a bit of buildup. I'm boosting a little bit here around 1.5K, just for a bit of presence, and then left everything else alone. From there, I added a Denise Perfect Room, and I'm using this to create a shimmer reverb. This is really, really nice on these types of pianos. About 3 seconds mixed in about 50-50. You can maybe mix this in a bit less. One of the other things I adjusted here in Perfect Room is the decay mode. So I have this on triangle instead of natural. So now this is just a linear decay of the reverb, which just makes it sound a bit bigger. Reminds me kind of the classic, 80s reverbs or stuff like Tal or Aural River. Finally, I end this with one more compressor. One of the other things I adjusted here in Perfect Room is the decay mode. So I have this on triangle instead of natural. So now this is just a linear decay of the reverb, which just makes it sound a bit bigger. Reminds me kind of the classic, 80s reverbs or stuff like Tal or Aural River. Finally, I end this with one more compressor. Again, being pretty aggressive, and this is just squeezing those tails together to make one big consistent sound. So it's still a piano, but it has a bit more transient pluckiness to it, and it just feels a bit more upfront. So one final thing you could maybe add is like a delay here. We could maybe just grab like stomp delay. Just for a bit more, rhythmic movement, but in this case, not really necessary. So that's kind of the core sound, and from here we need to supplement this, and this is what I typically use a sine, pluck, or bell type of sound for. Those are two very common sounds in the genre. So this is the pluck layer by itself. So this is actually just a sine wave out of Dune here. I'm not doing anything with effects or anything like that, just straight up sine wave, amplitude envelope here, creating a nice plucky sound. I've got a low pass and envelope here for the filter. Maybe add a bit of resonance, but filter drive is probably the more important thing. And that just creates a straight up little sine pluck. The release and decay are going to be the most important things to tweak. But as you can hear, very, straightforward, pretty sound. So from there, I added a stomp delay. Just a pretty short, relatively high feedback. Just adds a bit of space. From here, you can maybe also add like, we could maybe just do like a tal chorus. Bit more interesting. And then finally, I'm gonna put this into an oral river here. About 4 seconds, pretty wet. And that brings it up to this. And you'll hear we're occupying a very similar timbre area to the piano. So when you layer these two together, we get what sounds like one big sound, but we're using two very similar sounds to combine and create something a bit more interesting. And this is for a couple of reasons. One, we're layering stuff that sounds similar, and two, we're layering stuff that has a slightly different melody and rhythm to it. So, we kind of get a almost call and response type of thing going. When we layer this in with our sine pad layer, which is this guy here, which I already talked about, this is just made in rapid. Just a bit of chorus and delay on a sine wave here. We're getting something, again, very similar to the piano. And it's just filling out that extra space, because this is a long pad sound. And if we go ahead and bring in that pluck layer here, we end up with kind of the final completed melody sound that, sounds really big and huge. And that's a very important thing, is just, layering stuff and stacking things together that are complementary and, filling out a similar-ish space and timbre and, just kind of vibe and energy. But when you put them all together, they just morph into this new thing that sounds really big and interesting, which I think is the most important part. Because if you just had a piano playing, that's all well and good, but it's not going to be that interesting just because you can instantly go, oh, that is a piano. Whereas with this, it's a piano with a lot of processing, and there's some extra stuff happening, and, some layers and ear candy and movement, and, it's just an exciting sound that you go, wow, that sounds really huge, but it also, it has that emotional weight, like I talked about in the very first video. We're creating stuff that every sound contributes some kind of emotional characteristic to the final product. So once we add this in with our pad here, let's go ahead and just kind of solo out all of the melodic layers with the pad. We get one big completed sound that is very cohesive and all works together, and again, carries this emotional weight that, it just makes you, maybe it makes you sad, or maybe it makes you remember something or something like that. So this is the final result. So that is kind of the melodic aspect of all this put together. It's not anything crazy complicated. So one of the other common sounds I wanted to cover is a pretty common thing in like the wave scene as well, but is also pretty popular in some styles and artists, future garage. So we've got this here. This is a detuned saw patch, 5 voices or so. Detuned spread out pretty wide. I've got a bandpass filter with a filter envelope right here, so it's just moving a little bit. Cutoff is down. Touch of resonance, touch of drive, amplitude envelope, and this is the final sound here. I'm sure you'll recognize it right away. So very, very common sound. If we go ahead and play this with the track behind it, you'll hear, I guess, a bit more in context, and it should be, you know, pretty recognizable. So that's kind of the final sound, and another very common variation of this is using square waves instead, and you would get something like this. From there, we could mess with the filter envelope and amplitude envelope to get something maybe slightly more plucky. Another very common thing on this is using an arpeggiator on top of it, so we would just kind of do something a bit more like this. So that's a bit loud, but you get the idea. From there, you can maybe zero out the attack envelope and get something very plucky and transient-y. And that's another just super, super common sound to, you know, try out. Especially, you know, the squares and saw as well. When you do something like this that's very, very plucky, it can replace the sine pluck in kind of an interesting way. So yeah, that's you know, super common sound. What I've done to treat this, and something you can try, I've just added a little bit of reverb here, about 4 seconds. Another stomp delay, just adding a bit of, you know, interest to it, and then just a filter EQ here, cutting out the low end information. One other thing to consider as well is you can almost turn this into a brassy, stabby sound. So we could do something like this, maybe drop this down a bit more and make the filter a bit more aggressive. So especially as you go, you know, down into the lower octaves, you can almost get like a trap brass type of sound, which can be useful to accent, you know, kick drums and things like that here and there. I think Direct uses that a lot in his music. But yeah, that's a pretty common sound. So let's go ahead and start breaking down some quick music theory ideas. So I'm going to go ahead and leave my keyboard on screen here, and I'm just going to play just to demonstrate a couple things. But I just wanted to show a couple important ideas when it comes to music theory. If you're not all that familiar with music theory, you can pause this video and go to musictheory.net. I would get familiar with scale degrees, keys, things like diatonic chords, and you know, stuff like that. But there's a couple just basic concepts that I think are very important and that can be pretty easily illustrated to make you maybe a bit more comfortable with writing these types of melodies and whatnot. So for this, I'm going to be using my piano. I'm just going to turn off some of the effects, and I'm just going to kind of play a couple melodies, and you guys can see what's on my screen here with this keyboard, and you'll be able to see what I'm playing, but I just wanted to illustrate a couple concepts. So first off, this song is in the key of G sharp minor. So we can maybe go ahead and get rid of the mic warmer and stuff here and get something a bit more plain and easy to understand. But if we play a G minor chord or G sharp minor, it's not all that interesting by itself. So what would make this a bit more future garage sounding? Well, we can utilize the second degree of the scale, which is going to be an A sharp or a B flat, and that would sound like this when you use it with the minor third and the fifth together. So when we use the second degree with the minor third, we get this little bit of dissonance because we're utilizing both an A sharp and a B, which sounds like this together. If we played a G sharp 2, which would sound like this, that's a bit more abstract and interesting because it doesn't tell our ear and our brain is this major or minor. It could be either, because G sharp major, G sharp minor, G sharp 2, we don't get that color tone of the third that tells us is this major or minor. And it's the same with the fourth. If we play a G sharp 4, again, we don't get that major or minor indicator of the third. If we had the major third in there with that, very pretty. If we had the minor third in there with that, still very pretty, but we get that it's a minor. And same thing with the second. With the second and the major third, and the minor, as soon as we add that third in, it tells us what it is. So utilizing a more abstract note, not really an abstract note, but utilizing the second and fourth degrees is very important. And I'll show you if I just kind of improvise a little piano melody here, and I only make use of things like the third, the fifth, and the root, maybe the sixth and seventh as well, you'll hear it's just a bit uninteresting. So let me just go ahead and improvise something here. It sounds like just a very straightforward, meh type of thing. But once we throw in the second and fourth, things get a bit more interesting. So again, we're adding in this bit of information that kind of weaves you in and out of, like, it's a minor chord, but now it's not really minor or major, but now it's not really anything, something like that. And this is an important thing to keep in mind to create these more kind of abstract and interpretive melodies, I guess is what I would call it. So let's go ahead and analyze the actual melody and stuff I've used here and talk a little bit about, I guess, some easy tips and tricks when it comes to creating, melodies and progressions and stuff. So in terms of the actual piano here, this is actually very, very straightforward. So what I've got here is the root, and then up here I've got the fifth, and it's just an octave up. So if I play these down here, whoops, not that interesting, but by separating things about, an octave or so, let's go ahead and solo out the piano. We get kind of a sonic, division between the notes. If they're too clustered together, it's not that interesting. So what I've got here is just, you can see everything's about an octave apart, and then every once in a while I'm kind of drifting back down to bring the two notes together. And this isn't really, I guess, a theory thing so much as it is a feeling thing. I've got these two notes playing that are far apart, and then they kind of weave together, and then they split back up, and that's kind of the motion. You want this tension and a bit of release, and tension, and then a bit of release, and that's kind of what we're playing off of here. And then sometimes I'm hitting higher notes that are way up. So I'm, tension, tension, more, and then bringing it back together. So this is the completed piano line. So if we kind of look back through here again, we can see I'm utilizing the minor third, the second, I've got the fifth up here. Whoops. I've got a root. Down here I've got a second. Root again, and then I've got a seventh here. So, this way I'm hitting the minor third and stuff to, let you know this is a sad song and whatever, but, I'm not using it all the time except, in the second chord, and then I'm going down to the second here, and doing that kind of like 1-3-2 type of thing can really be interesting. It's not a ultra common progression, so it's, a bit weird. And then the bass line is actually doing an entirely different progression, which I'll show here in a minute. But one of the things that I like to utilize a lot in writing these piano melodies or pluck melodies is actually very simple. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull the piano back up here, and I'll show you what I mean. So I could, since I'm doing that 1-3-2 type of thing, I could just play G sharp minor, and then I could go, and play the chords, and that's just not that interesting. Instead, what I like to do is actually just play kind of one note, and then use another note that is just in the other hand and is just maybe a bit separate, and that creates a bit more character and interest overall to the melody. So I'll show you what I mean. So that would just kind of be a very straightforward one without that messed up note in there. But a cool thing to do is actually just use kind of borrowed notes from other chords to get a bit more color out of these things. So instead of playing, just G sharp minor, I could borrow something from another chord within the key, which would be your diatonic chords, and this could be really interesting and create a lot of color. So in a way, what I like to think of is like almost playing a separate chord progression with my right hand than with my left hand. There's a more in-depth music theory way to approach this, but I'm just trying to think of an easy way to describe it. And the best I can say is just play different notes in your right hand than whatever's going on with whatever's in the left hand. This way you can kind of create some more interesting colors and characteristics to your chords rather than just straight up, minor, major, same chord in two different octaves. You're kind of splitting up the voicings and getting more interesting colors and tones out of things. So in terms of the actual melodic arrangement and whatnot here, if we go and open up our pluck layer, we can take a look at what's going on here. So you'll see I'm kind of keeping a different rhythm with the pluck layer. The piano is just very straightforward. If we go and open up the metronome here. So without the pluck, the piano is just kind of this slow, morose thing. It's, da, 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 So what I'm doing is utilizing the pluck to enhance that second move of da, da, and I'm using that the whole time, which creates two different rhythms, and then I'm using different notes here as well. So this creates a bit of a counterpoint with the plucking part against the piano, which adds up to a fuller sounding chord. And going up there to that E creates a really interesting bit of tension because, it's not really a traditional note. We might go up to like the G sharp again. We could maybe go down to the 4, on the C sharp or something like that. But, ending on that E really creates a bit of tension. So, you can do that on the end or in the middle of phrases is take your 5 and make it sharp. Just go up a half step. Create some really interesting tension that can be really quickly released. So yeah, that's kind of how I approach these melodies and stuff like that. So from here, I've just created a bit more interesting movement by using a bass line that's kind of going in a different direction. So if we open up our bass here and take a look, you'll see that I'm not starting on the 1 or the G sharp, which I could. It would just be very expected, I suppose is the word. But instead what I'm doing is kind of following the melody rather than the actual chord progression in a way. So I start on the E, which is very, very dissonant, going down to the D sharp, going down to the G. And that creates a lot of kind of tension and movement because, we have a very pretty melody that kind of plays almost a standard-ish, melody and vibe, but the bass line kind of provides this aggressive undertone to it all. And you hear the bass line is what makes it really sinister. So, we have this very delicate, almost feminine melody, and then this very masculine, aggressive bass that, again, like I said, gives it this kind of sinister undertone and, makes you maybe a bit uneasy overall. So another point I'd like to bring up here is I see a lot of producers do something, I guess, like this, where it would just be the same quick little 4-bar bass loop. which in some cases it can work, but I find using a second kind of response, again, I'm doing this kind of call response thing, I find that's really important with melody and the bass line, especially in this genre, is just, you know, creating a question and an answer is the way to think of it if you're not familiar with call and response in music. So what I've got here is this first bassed phrase. So I'm going dun, 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 which is very common, and then I'm answering with this. So dun, dun, dun. And you see how those two are pretty complementary, and you know, we're kind of in similar territory in terms of notes, but we're creating two different kind of chord progressions, I guess, going on under the chords, which again creates a more full and lush voicing overall. So again, when we put everything together here with that sine pad and our main vocoder pad, we get a very big, very full voicing and a very, you know, interesting chord progression that's not just like a 4-bar loop over and over and over. So another thing, I guess, to enhance on this and something to keep in mind as well is when you create your initial, I guess, 8 bars here, duplicate this out and add a variation the second time around. And then, you know, kind of keep that in mind of adding subtle changes and tweaks every once in a while. That way it's not just the same loops and stuff over and over and over. You know, just that little bit of variation can always keep your ear interested and keep your listener, you know, guessing and waiting to hear, you know, what's the resolution, where's this going, and, you know, keeping in mind as well, what can you do later on in your B section, which we'll talk about more when we get into the arrangement aspect of this whole series. So I know this was a bit of a longer video. I know this was a lot of ground to cover, and I know my music theory explanations were not super great and in depth, but again, I'm just trying to approach all this from a very emotional standpoint, and I'm not saying you need to have a super deep understanding of theory, but having enough of an understanding of music theory to understand what creates tension, you know, what creates a sad feeling and things like that is very important. But ultimately, don't overthink the theory aspect of it. Just play something and, you know, try variations on it until you find something that really strikes you and something that sits with the vibe you want to curate. Because ultimately, when I'm creating this stuff, the first thing I create is those atmospheric sound beds. And I wait for my brain to think of, you know, what does this remind me of? What does this make me think of? And, you know, then I'll kind of build the melody around that, something that captures that feeling and that vibe I want to curate. It could be very sad. It could be very dark. It could just be a really low rumbling bass. You know, it could be a very pretty piano. It could be a harp. You know, it could be any number of things. But ultimately, the biggest thing is creating a melody that's kind of slow and silky and, you know, just goes more for feeling than complexity and tons of notes overall. But yeah, I think that wraps it up for this video. And that's it for this video, so I hope you learned something, I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to like and subscribe, be sure to stay tuned for part 5, and I will see you guys again soon.